My most recent videos talking about game development have been focused more on the production side of things, going over the importance of good documentation and more generally the idea of just trying to keep all of your developers on your team on the same page. Link in the description and the cards if you want to check those out, by the way. But of course, while I do think that my video does a good job of explaining all that, there are lots of different methods of documenting and organizing your game's production, and no two games are going to be made the exact same way. So, what I want to talk about today is more about the actual end goal of trying to organize your game's development in the first place, and what is, in my opinion, the kind of mindset you should have when you go into designing and producing your game. Because sure, you can have the most in-depth documentation, you can know exactly what you want each developer to do, and each developer might be capable of doing it. But if your initial mindset of how you designed your game in the first place is flawed, then those flaws are going to permeate every step of the process. Which is why today I want to talk about something called holistic design. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, I'll admit that I myself never even really heard of the word holistic until a few years ago, if I'm being totally honest with myself. So, for those of you who don't know, the word holistic essentially means that when you're observing something or trying to solve a problem, you want to not just look directly at the individual parts, but rather you want to take into account the whole of whatever you're looking at and everything around it that might be affecting it. So, for example, say someone comes into a doctor complaining about foot pains. Then, yes, obviously looking directly at the patient's foot can probably reveal some relevant information. But if you really want to address the root of the problem, you might need some more information. So, it could be useful to think about things like what kind of shoes the patient is wearing, how often they go for walks and where they're doing those walks, or how often they're exercising in general, and things like their diet, and so on and so forth. And by taking in all of these relevant factors beyond just looking directly at the side of the problem itself, you can come to a greater understanding about the nature of the issue and how to properly diagnose and solve the root of the problem. And to use a somewhat more comical example, I remember seeing a story someone posted a while ago about a manager who was upset that people kept just throwing the paper towels in the public bathroom all over the floor instead of using the trash can. So they put up a sign to tell people to use the trash can. But people just kept throwing their trash on the floor, and so they kept putting up more signs that kept not doing anything. And the ultimate reason why this kept happening was because the trash can was placed on the opposite side of the bathroom as the exit. So when people like using paper towels to open the door when they leave, that meant that the trash can was far out of their reach, so they would just dump it on the floor as they left. So essentially, the manager was so laser focused on the issue of there just being trash that he didn't stop to consider the larger picture and realize that if he had simply moved the trash can closer to the door, then people would have more naturally used it without even needing a single sign. Now, to be fair, the term holistic has been abused around a variety of pseudosciency circles, but the core point of what I'm getting at is this general philosophy of observing the whole in place of just its individual parts. You know, you don't want to miss the forest for the trees and all that jazz. So, what I mean when I talk about holistic design in gaming is that I believe it's important when making your game to think about the game as a whole whenever you're adding or adjusting any of its mechanics. Because if you just start adding or changing in your mechanics all willy nilly without ever thinking about how they interact with the rest of the game's systems, well. To be serious though, and to bring up the most obvious example that you all already know that I was going to talk about, I do think that this is the real underlying problem with games like Starfield. I've seen lots of people point to very specific issues with the game and try to come up with ways to solve them. Lots of things that could be very easily patched in at some point, like a better inventory management system, proper region maps, improved UI, reduced loading screens, and so on and so forth. And I wouldn't deny that fixing a lot of these minor issues would make Starfield a better game. But the real question is if it would actually be a good game if you fixed all those problems. Because in my opinion, at its core, Starfield would still be holistically badly designed, even if you fixed all of these minor complaints. The deepest issues with the game are not things that can be solved with a few patches and quality of life features, and the few parts of it that can be solved with minor updates, I would argue are only the way they are because the game was not designed holistically. For example, one of the most well-regarded aspects of Starfield is the starship building. Now, it does still have a lot of problems that plenty of people have pointed out. Things like how you can't really decorate the interiors, or even control where doorways and ladders are when you connect to larger rooms, and some kind of system for being able to, say, buy and store ship parts without actually equipping them to your ship would make it a lot easier to build more complex ships using parts from different stores. The list of possible improvements goes on and on. But the biggest issue with shipbuilding, in my opinion, is not really with the shipbuilding system itself. It's that there is very little incentive to actually do anything with your ships after they've been built. Flying between planets and star systems is almost entirely based on menu navigation, so you don't actually spend any real time enjoying the interior of your ship when you're just traveling around. And combat is so basic and simplistic that the nuances of different kinds of ships barely feels like it matters in a fight. My point being that even if this was the most in-depth and most versatile shipbuilding system in any game ever, without an actual reason to want to fly ships around, you're just wasting your time by focusing too much on trying to fix that one mechanic specifically. So yes, they might improve the shipbuilding system with patches and updates and DLC and whatnot, but unless they actually completely overhaul how ship combat works and stuff like how you travel between planets and such, then it'll still feel pointless to actually engage with the shipbuilding system for any reason beyond just painting your ship pretty colors. But that, of course, is a negative example of what it looks like when you don't design your game holistically. So, to get a better idea of what it looks like when you do it right, we should probably look at a more positive example. And I think that one of the better examples of this kind of design is, of course, Link's core set of 4 abilities that you get during the tutorial are, in my opinion, a great example of how well you can incorporate your core mechanics into your game's design holistically. I think that a good test to see how well integrated a mechanic is to simply imagine what the game would be like if you removed it entirely. Like, what you would have to change to make the game still function without it. So, for example, if you took out the Ascend ability, well, for one, Ascend fits very well thematically into the game's vertical nature with all the floating islands and whatnot, so you lose out on that aspect entirely by removing it. And of course, needless to say that a lot of the game's level design is based around you having access to this ability. You can definitely still get around some Ascend-based puzzles with things like Ultra Hand contraptions, but not all of them. And especially in puzzle rooms where you can't summon just whatever Zonai contraptions you want. And for that matter, that leads nicely into Ultra Hand itself, which might arguably be the most holistically incorporated ability in that game. Not only are there tons of Zonai mechanics that primarily work with Ultra Hand that are spread throughout the entire game, but a vast majority of the game's shrine puzzles probably would have to be completely rewritten, and a lot of boss fights and quests throughout the game also rely on Ultra Hand mechanics as well. Basically, if you took out Ultra Hand entirely, you would have to make basically a completely different game. And that just goes to show how well incorporated into the entire game the mechanic is. The game and the mechanic are functionally inseparable. You can tell that nearly every aspect of the game was designed with Ultra Hand in mind just by playing it. Moving on, Recall is interesting to me because of its story significance. Yes, like the other abilities, it's used in a lot of puzzles, and it's very useful systemically in a lot of other situations as well, like in combat. But the entire story of the game would have to be rewritten if you didn't include the recall ability. Not to spoil things too much, but it is basically Zelda's main power during her cutscenes and plays a huge role in the plot. And finally we have Fuse, which I'll admit is probably the least holistic of the four main abilities. If you apply my impromptu test to it and imagine the game with Fuse removed, the game still, I think, would be functional for the most part. I think the game would be much lesser by removing Fuse, but it's nowhere near as critical to the overall experience as the other three have been so far. So I would say that while it is useful throughout a huge amount of the game, it's not quite as holistically designed as the other abilities. Very few puzzles, if any, really require you to fuse objects to your weapons, and you could get through most of the game's combat challenges without really requiring you to fuse anything. It would be harder, of course, but not by that much. I think Fuse is much more used out of convenience, really, than necessity. But it is still holistic to some degree, in my opinion, because a large amount of the game does still take Fuse into account, namely the enemy design. The main point of the Fuse ability is that enemies can now drop weapon parts for the player so that they can fuse them, and then they don't have to rely on just whatever weapons the enemy drops when you kill them. So, while it isn't as well incorporated as a necessity into huge swaths of the game, like Ultra Hand or Ascend, it is still something that most players are going to be using on a regular basis, and the game is designed around them doing that. So, it is at least still, to some degree, considered throughout the game's whole design, just by a smaller degree by my judgment. But I think that this leads naturally into the next point that I want to make, which is that not every game necessarily needs to take an entirely holistic approach to its overall design. And even when you are considering things holistically, you don't need to design every mechanic to be as widespread as possible. This may sound like I'm contradicting myself a little, but let me explain. See, when you're designing a game holistically, you don't need to necessarily make sure that every mechanic is incorporated into every facet of your entire game. Rather, you just need to make sure that you're taking into account that mechanic for every situation that it can be used in. To go back to my doctor example from earlier, if a patient is complaining of foot pain, that probably doesn't have to do with a minor pain in their pinky finger or what the patient next door is complaining about. Essentially, while yes, you do want to take into account as many factors as possible, you also need to be able to filter out the noise and any irrelevant information. I think a good comparison that explains what I mean is to look at the power-ups in a Mario platformer and compare them to the power-ups in a game like Pizza Tower. In Mario Wonder, and most any Mario game for that matter, the power-ups are typically not tied to any specific level. In fact, if you beat a level without taking any damage, then you're able to carry that power-up forwards into the next one. But at the same time, any amount of damage that you take also removes your power-up and reduces you back to your normal state. That means that when thinking about the game holistically, you can't design a level specifically around a certain power-up being required to beat it, because a player could always take damage and lose that power-up. And at the same time, you need to design every level with every power-up in mind, since you can bring any power-up to any level. So you don't want it to be possible to completely negate the challenge or break a level just because they found a way to use the elephant power-up in a level that wasn't designed for it or something like that. So in this context, you really can't afford to not think about the game holistically, because if you fail to take into account the game's power-up system in its entirety for each level, then you might risk making a level uncompletable or completely broken, or, at best, you might just make a power-up feel worthless because there's no opportunities to use it. Conversely, if we look at Pizza Tower, that game's power-ups work completely differently. Unlike Mario, once you get a power-up, you actually can't lose it unless you pay a visit to the Pizza Pope. And even if you somehow beat a level with a power-up equipped, you cannot carry it into any other level. So you always enter a level in your default state. This gives the developers a lot more control over how their power-ups are going to be used, and thus they're able to design their levels much more specifically around each power-up. And in turn, there's no need to think holistically about how every power-up is going to work in every level. But of course, that doesn't mean that they're just able to design power-ups all willy-nilly without a care in the world. It could still be possible to take a power-up to a power of the level where it's not intended to be used, or vice versa. So it's still important to design the level such that, when you get a power-up, it's impossible to access without that power-up, or vice versa. But overall, there's no need to think about things like how the knight power-up is going to work in the cowboy level and stuff like that. So what we can take away from this is that, like I said at the beginning, just because you're thinking of something holistically doesn't mean you need to take into account every extraneous factor that might not have anything to do with what mechanic you're currently designing. A core skill is to recognize and identify what parts of your game are relevant to each mechanic, and to keep all of those parts in mind when you're designing that mechanic. And then to keep that mechanic in mind when you're designing all of those other parts. As such, a game can quickly become a complex web of ideas, with each system or mechanic not necessarily interacting with every other mechanic in the game directly, but rather that you need to keep track of how they interact with each other. Changing one mechanic could require a change to a system that interacts with it, but that system might interact with other mechanics as well, thus requiring some adjustments to them too, thus leading back to what I was getting at about needing to take a holistic approach to your game, even if every mechanic isn't necessarily applicable to every single situation in your game. Otherwise, you might put a piece in the wrong place and the whole Jenga tower collapses. But there's one last thing I want to talk about before I wrap up this video, which is that thinking about your game holistically isn't always just to make your game feel more cohesive for the sake of the player. Sometimes you can realize that the way a system works could be used to make your life easier as a developer if you incorporated it into other parts of the game. I think the most basic and commonly used example of this in a lot of different games would be to say take a game with a character creator that also has a lot of NPCs to populate their world. If you have a character creator for the player, then you can use that system to make your NPCs, or even to generate them procedurally by just picking character options at random. Probably within some reasonable bounds, of course, to avoid flooding the world with Cronenberg abominations. But the point is that way you don't have to make an entirely different system just to make your NPCs, or even worse, force your artists to manually sculpt each one of the hundreds of random characters in the world individually. Now, you might still have some wholly unique NPCs, of course, but the street goes both ways. If you want to have some more unique features for an NPC, like say a fancy mohawk or something, instead of just making that new hairdo specifically for that NPC and never using it again, you could incorporate it into the character creator, and now you've added more options for the players to enjoy, while also making your life easier for making your NPCs. And to use a different example from a game I personally worked on for a school project, my team was making a stealth game, and there were things like security guards and cameras in it. Now, I could have programmed the cameras and guards to have their own methods of detecting the player, but instead I made a much more general system for player detection that was able to be plugged into both the cameras and the security guards without having to code them individually. And as a result, we realized that we could use that system for making things like laser tripwires and other similar mechanics that we didn't initially plan for, but realized could be trivial to add to the game thanks to how our mechanics had been made. So like I said, if you think about your game holistically, then you might realize that a certain piece of code or a level asset or something like that might be able to be used in ways beyond their initial intended purpose, and in turn make your life a lot easier as a developer. And of course, I think this naturally leads us to circle around back to the popular topic of the day, Starfield. And I believe that when you think about Starfield through this holistic lens, it becomes clear that there are a lot of wasted opportunities that weren't taken advantage of because the mechanics were clearly developed in a vacuum instead of being thought about holistically. For instance, a huge amount of Starfield is procedurally generated. But a common complaint among many is that a lot of the points of interest that you can find on these random maps are the exact same cookie cutter buildings that get reused over and over again with the exact same layouts, the same enemies, the same clutter on all the same furniture. It just feels exceedingly artificial and bad to find the same asset on 20 different planets completely unchanged. And to be fair, making a lot of unique assets would be hard and time consuming, so it makes sense that they would eventually start to repeat after a while. But meanwhile, you have the game's outpost building system, which allows the player to create custom buildings on virtually any planet by sticking different types of rooms together. It has a lot of its own issues, like how you can take a long time to grind for all the different materials and resources and research items that you need in order to actually build anything of substance, but let's put those aside for a moment. When I first saw that the game had an outpost building system, I assumed, perhaps foolishly, that the entire reason why they would even bother to add a player-facing outpost building system is because they would have had a natural system already in place for building procedurally generated structures on their maps. Because surely they would have first created a system to create random layouts out of pre-built rooms so that they could have a much wider variety of unique dungeons for the player to explore, and then only after they made that system would they have thought to let the player use those rooms to make their own structures as well. But of course, that's only what would have happened if someone was actually looking at Starfield holistically. Instead, it seems that the people working on making procedurally generated planets and the people working on making the outpost building were doing so without ever thinking to have them work together to improve both the systems from each other's work. Just like my example with NPCs and character creators, the outpost building system could have been used to generate way more unique feeling points of interest, and conversely, if there were any unique kinds of rooms or furniture that the map makers wanted to put in the game, then those could have been added to the outpost building system to make it more versatile and complex. But that's only the start of it. They could have used this combination of systems to add even more features without necessarily taking a lot more work. Like say maybe after you clear out one of these dungeon outposts, the player could gain control of it and convert it into a base without needing to invest nearly as many resources into it. Or hell, maybe they could just dismantle the outpost so that they could use the resources to build their own base however they want, and in turn, either way, dramatically cut down on how much grinding you need to do in order to get building materials. And even if you're not interested in outpost building at all, this still means that the game has created a far more interesting set of points of interest for you to explore, and being able to break them down for resources could also mean that you get more resources for things like upgrading your weapons and armor or completing research goals, playing into even more of the game's systems. And of course, upgrading your weapons and armor make you more equipped to fight more baddies in more outposts to get more materials, creating a fairly natural gameplay loop that encourages exploration and combat. And maybe some of those resources could even be used to craft spaceship parts so that you don't have to necessarily buy all of them. And just like that, suddenly we've tied together many of the game's disparate systems by simply thinking them holistically and trying to make them interact with each other, instead of just thinking of each system as a completely separate mechanic that happens to be in the same game. I haven't even really added anything to the game, at least not anything that would take that much dev time. All I've really done is taken the game's existing ideas and mechanics and tried to tie them all together so that they more naturally play off of each other and become greater than the sum of their parts. I think the best analogy that describes my thoughts on Starfield is that it feels like it was made like a jigsaw puzzle where every team was told to design a piece of the puzzle in complete isolation and without coordinating with anyone else, tying back into my video about documentation for that matter. And unsurprisingly, when it comes time to try and put the whole thing together, none of the individual pieces seem to fit quite right, and it barely makes any sense. And sure, maybe over time you can shave down some of the rough edges, trim some of the pieces into better shape, and help make the puzzle fit together more smoothly with updates and DLC and whatnot. But that won't change the fact that at the end of the day, the actual picture that you're trying to put together will still end up looking like a jumbled mess because nobody actually had a clear idea as to what they were trying to do in the first place. So yeah, to close this whole thing out, I recall a time that one of my game design professors once said something that caught me and a lot of other people in the class off guard, which was the idea that emergent gameplay was bad. Now, naturally, with how often I've heard emergent gameplay touted as a feature and a buzzword, my first reaction was that that was kind of absurd, right? But I think I understand more of what he meant now, even if maybe he didn't do a good job of explaining it at the time. Essentially, he was talking about the idea of your players finding some interaction with your game systems that you didn't account for, but that leads to some kind of new gameplay. Now, the issue isn't that the players found some fun way of enjoying your game. The issue is specifically with the part where you didn't account for it. Because while sure, that unintended interaction between systems can sometimes lead to a fun gameplay opportunity, it could just as easily have led to things like degenerate strategies that completely ruin the game's balance or economy, or an exploit that lets players access parts of the game that they were never meant to reach. It's your responsibility as the game's designer to know your game systems inside and out, and to know how interactions between those systems should play out, lest you risk things getting way out of hand once it's been given to the players. Sure, you might not be able to catch everything, nobody is perfect, but the only way that you can possibly hope to is by looking at your game as a whole, and not focusing too hard on the individual systems on their own. And that, in my opinion, is how you make your game greater than just the sum of its parts. So yeah, first big video of the new year. If you're hearing this, then thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, and as usual, if you have anything you want to add to the discussion, I'm always happy to continue the conversation down in the comments below. If you want to support the channel, then a like would be appreciated, and if you want to see me make more videos like this one, then make sure to hit subscribe and ring the bell so that you can get notified about when I make more videos like this one. And also, I learned recently that apparently the subscribe button glows when I say that, so, I mean, that's just kind of a funny feature. But finally, I also decided to open up a Ko-Fi, so there's a link in the description below if you want to donate and help me keep doing what I love and help me keep making more videos in the future. But with that, once again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.